You have to say no. Because by giving them money, by giving them what they want, by giving them the credit card so they can go to Whole Foods as opposed to Publix or Kroger or Albertsons or whatever, you are doing more damage to them. You're doing more harm to them than by saying no. Saying no is the loving answer because you're telling them they've got to get off their butt and make a life for themselves. They have to learn to be self-sufficient because one day, I'm not going to be here for you. It is hard, particularly when your kid is in their 20s and 30s and this is happening to them, which is why I'm telling parents now who are younger, who have kids who are younger, still making mistakes at 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, 15 years old, let them make those mistakes, encourage those mistakes, and use those as learning moments for them, teachable moments. Look, you spent all your money on one Pokemon card, and now you can't go do anything else. And mom is not going to give you the money. I gave you the money for your allowance. We agreed on your allowance, and now you've spent it all. You can't just look at it, realize there's a problem, and then just hope it goes away. It's not going to go away. You can't just look at it and say, it's too much for me to handle, I'll come back to it next week or next month or whatever. It'll be my New Year's resolution. You can't do that. I mean, you really have to say, I have to fix this problem, and I have to fix this problem now. There's that famous saying, when's the best time to plant a tree? It was 20 years ago. When's the second best time to plant a tree? Well, it's today. Today is the day you have to start.
Welcome to Catching Up to Fi, a podcast on mindset, money, and life for late starters of any age on their journey to financial independence. I'm Bill, and I'm a late starter.
I'm Becky, and I'm also a late starter, and we're your hosts. We're here to help you with your journey to financial independence, no matter where you're starting from.
We're going to talk to experts, other late starters, and explore topics related to our mission.
Join us as we catch up to Fi together.
Hello, and welcome back to Catching Up to Fi. I'm Bill Yount with my co-host Jackie Cummings-Koski, who joins me again as guest host while Becky decides if she's ever coming back from Bali. How are you doing today, Jackie?
I'm doing great. Hey, look at this, round 2. I'm feeling pretty special.
Well, it's great to have you back. You were on our show back in the early episodes, and you're such a passionate person about financial literacy. It's great to have you here talking with us today to Jeff Opdyke. Jeff was born and raised in southern Louisiana and grew up traveling the world and has never really stopped. He spent 17 years covering personal finance and investing for the Wall Street Journal. For 7 years, he wrote the journal's nationally syndicated Love and Money column that chronicled the real ways personal finances and personal relationships clash. As executive editor for The Sovereign Investor and Total Wealth Insider, Jeff traveled the world meeting politicians, economists, institutional investors, taxi drivers, waitresses, hotel bellhops, and supermarket checkout clerks to better understand local economies and local consumers in a quest to find investment opportunities outside of America. His book, Replay, Your Second Chance to Invest in the American Dream, was a direct result of those years of global encounters. Among his 10 books, Jeff has also written Financially Ever After, The Couple's Guide to Managing Money, and Piggy Banking, Preparing Your Financial Life for Kids and Your Kids for Financial Life. He has also written several screenplays. Jeff has traveled to more than 70 countries and currently works as a digital nomad living and writing from Cascais, Portugal, about retirement lifestyle, travel, and global investing. Jeff is the editor of the Global Intelligence Letter, International Living's Guide to a Richer, More Rewarding Life. I encountered Jeff when listening to episode 2 of Bite Your Tongue, the podcast with host Denise Gorant. Becky and I were fortunate to meet Denise at Podcast Movement in August. Jeff joined Denise on her show on April 30th, 2021 for a discussion on adult children and money. He gave advice when to just say no. He said point blank, boomers are the most financially ignorant people on the planet. Most importantly, he warned us that we are moving into a time that is going to be filled with a lot of hurt, honestly, and kids need to understand how to best manage their money. Okay, Jeff, Jackie, we're happy to welcome you, Jeff, to Catching Up to Fi.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate you letting me be here.
Happy to be here too, Bill.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Our first topic today is kids and money. Now, our co-host Jackie wrote a book, Letters to My Daughter, describing how kids should approach money in their early years. And in my case, I have a little parable of the thrifty and spendthrifty twins in a life of plenty. Without saying exactly who it is, let's just say these kids grew up with a lifestyle inflation, poor mentorship models. And at the end of the day, one was a spendthrift and one was thrifty. It's hard to understand why that happened and why was there that dichotomy. Jeff, do you have any ideas on why when people are mentored in that fashion, they end up in completely two ends of the thrifty spectrum?
I would be willing to bet it's an older child versus a younger child. Which one was the spendthrift?
Well, it's actually twins, so it makes it more
Ah,
interesting.
uh,
Yeah, the same
I,
modeling and totally different outcomes.
wow, I do not have an answer for that. I have no guess at that one.
Well, it's fascinating to me because we have to see that one recovers and one just proceeds along their path. Now, what is the scope of the problem with adult children of money today, especially with regards to late starters that may have modeled completely incorrectly for their kids?
Well, the challenge I see is that there's so many children, and I'm talking about adult children who grew up with particularly Gen X parents, and I'm Gen X. And Gen X was a generation that was not really cared for by the boomers. We're the last of the feral children, and we overcompensated for that with our own kids. So we go out there and we have to fight for our financial lives because boomers weren't going to really take care of us. And so we're out there, we're working our butt off every day. We've got 2 or 3 jobs, particularly if you're in a family in America today, has to have 2 jobs, 2 careers to afford lifestyle that you want to call it, sort of the American middle class, the American dream. Because of that, we are so devoted to our pursuit of that American dream that the kids, while they're an important part of our lives, were kind of neglected simply out of necessity of driving to work every morning and the rush hour back home and having to do everything in a crush and in a rush, and you're taking kids to soccer practice and swim classes and dance classes and things like that. Kids kind of get overlooked in all that because there's just so much going on in our lives, and our way of compensating for that as parents was to basically give them what they want, give them anything they want. You were talking about lifestyle inflation. I have a really good example of that. I had 2 children. I have a son and a daughter, and because of my career, I was incredibly busy. As you mentioned, I was traveling the world. As you might imagine, I racked up a ton of airline miles. And so every once in a while, I would take the family and we'd go fly to Europe for a vacation or whatever. So my kids grew up basically flying in business class to London or Paris or Milan or wherever we went on vacation. And we got on a plane one day and we were flying from, I don't know, like Dallas to, I don't know where we were going, maybe Montreal or somewhere like that. Or I think it was Vancouver, actually, Vancouver, Canada. And we get on the plane, and my daughter just reflexively turns to the left when she gets on the plane to go towards first class, as opposed to taking the turn to the right to go to coach class. And I looked at her and I said, "Hey, Nicole, it's over this way." She goes, "No, I'm not sitting back there." She's so accustomed to that lifestyle that I had given her through free miles, basically, that she just couldn't accept anything that was actually under first class, business class kind of stuff. We have raised children as Xers to kind of expect that because we've just given them anything and everything they want. And as they've grown up, they don't know how to manage money themselves. That's why so many millennials and the Gen Zs and whatnot are still living at home with parents because they just haven't been able to figure out how to create a money life for themselves because their money life has basically been handed to them by their parents.
Yeah, I've seen that actually with my kids, and you're spot on.
Oh.
They do get everything they want. They expect it, and it's a cold shower or a jump into the deep end when they launch or attempt to launch into the real world and they actually live that poor student life. It's been a cold shower for my kids, and it's not easy to watch because as a parent, you want to help. And this is the problem for boomers and Gen Xers. You don't want to see them, quote unquote, suffer. And one of them lives the bohemian lifestyle and loves it. He's doing fine. The other one remains to be seen where this is going to end up. But I think we are helping recover these kids by modeling our late start and all of the changes we're making. They're well aware that we ended up in a problem and they're watching the recovery. And I'm proud to say that I've got my kids contributing to their Roth IRAs early on. They're reading books like The Simple Path to Wealth, and they've been told early on that there is a better way. Meet your future self and take care of that person. Now, Jackie wrote a book, as we mentioned before, Letters to My Daughter. Jackie, how has it gone for you and your daughter? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I can resonate with everything that Jeff is saying. I always struggle with walking that fine line of giving my daughter a better life than I had versus not spoiling her and making her feel entitled. That is one of the most difficult things. But when I wrote the book, she was around 14. So she was a teenager. Now she's in her 20s. And I can say that she did learn more from what I did versus what I said. So her watching me do certain things had more of an impact on her than I ever imagined. So the whole having adult kids is difficult, and it's hard to start when they become an adult. Like that modeling is better when it happens when they're younger. So Bill, you must find it kind of hard that they're almost adults and now you're trying to show them the right way to do it where you probably wish you would have done it a lot younger.
Well, for late starters, there's a lot of shoulda, coulda, woulda. And
Right.
do you have any tips, Jeff, on how to recover these children of the late boomers and Gen Xers that did exactly what you said they did?
Tough love, honestly. And I had this conversation, as much as I'm talking about boomers and Xers and the millennials and the Zs under them, this is not necessarily just a boomer issue. My grandmother was part of the greatest generation ever, born in 1921. She raised a boomer, my mom. And my mom was the embodiment of a princess born in the wrong age. She expected every single thing to be given to her without her having to lift a finger. And my mom and I got into fights about this all the time. And my grandmother used to cry about this kind of stuff because my grandmother was supporting my mom so much financially throughout her entire life, every stage of her life. Even when my mom was in her 60s and 70s, my grandmother was in her 80s and 90s, still working at times. And I had this conversation with my grandmother, and this is getting to the point of your question, which is you have to say no. Because by giving them money, by giving them what they want, by giving them the credit card so they can go to Whole Foods as opposed to Publix or Kroger or Albertsons or whatever, you are doing more damage to them. You're doing more harm to them than by saying no. Saying no is the loving answer because you're telling them they've got to get off their butt and make a life for themselves. They have to learn to be self-sufficient because one day I'm not going to be here for you. And then what are you going to do? And that's exactly what my mom faced. I mean, my mom had a huge come to Jesus awakening moment when my grandmother passed away, and there was nobody left to fund my mom's life. So the answer to your question is just say no. You know, it's a Nancy Reagan quote, just say no. Because if you don't say no, you are creating a monster that is going to not only destroy you, they're going to consume themselves.
Hey, Jeff, and I wish somebody would have put the warning on the side of the can that when you say no, it is hard. When got to that mindset and knew that there's certain things that just wasn't aligned with my values or what I wanted to teach her, it was hard. But thinking about on the other end, it's like if I don't say no, what am I teaching her? But it was attitude for a while. Then you kind of get a little bit of backlash and just expect that. Like they're not going to take it laying down, but sometimes that's what you have to do with kids. But the no is hard.
You feel crummy about it. I mean, I've said no to my kids and I
Yeah.
feel like a schmuck. I mean, I hate saying no to them. But by the same token,
Right.
I want them to be self sufficient. I want them to know that my no is not coming from a place of dad's a jerk. It's coming from a place of Dad loves me and he wants me to learn to be self-sufficient. And there's another element to this, which is I I have to be able to take care of myself later in life. I don't want to be in a position where I've spent my entire life giving everything I have to my kids and I haven't been able to save for myself and prepare for retirement. So now when I get to retirement, I'm leaning on my kids. And kids are going to regret that, or not regret that, they're going to resent that. And they're going to be like, well, why do I have to pay for you because you didn't save? Well, I didn't save because I was paying for you. That becomes these really hard arguments and fights to have between parents and their kids and their adult kids. So by saying no, you're helping them, but you're also helping yourself and you're helping the future them so that you're not in a position where you are now reliant on your children in retirement because you haven't saved enough.
Exactly. I mean, do you think this is part of that very large retirement crisis that we have in the United States?
I think it's some of it, absolutely. I mean, the other part of it is clearly the U.S. economy. I mean, the U.S. economy, despite the Federal Reserve and its mandate of creating stability, has done a horrific job of creating stability in the last 20 some odd years. So we've gone through the dot-com crash, we've gone through the housing crisis, we've gone through the COVID issues. So we've had some pretty nasty moments over the last 20 years in America that have destroyed a great deal of wealth. We've also had a lot of political issues that have come up in America over the last 20 some odd years or even longer that have destroyed the middle class by destroying trade unions and things like that. I'm not going to get into all that, but there are other policy issues that have come out of the American experience over the last, let's call it, since the Reagan Revolution, that has created the world we're in today and has created a middle class that is shrinking, has created the largest wealth gap in America probably since before the Great Depression. So there are policy issues that are involved in some of this, but it's also the fact that parents have wanted to take care of their kids and so they spend to the end and they take out loans and they send them to expensive colleges and the money that they would have been saving for retirement has gone other places. So yes, that's part of the reason we do have this retirement crisis.
I mean, how bad is it? I mean, we hear that people can't afford a $1,000 emergency expense. Do you have any idea how bad is it in America, and why is it potentially worse than other countries?
It is pretty bad here. There's the Federal Reserve. I think it was the Federal Reserve or maybe the Treasury. One of those agencies. You know, they have this study where most Americans, or 60%, where the number is, can't afford a $400 emergency expense. And I don't know how accurate that is. I'm just going to go on the statistic they come up with. And that to me is a very telling number. I've seen a bunch of statistics come out in recent months, and I've written some of these in I have a daily column I write, and I've written about some of this. Gen Xers are hugely underprepared for retirement. You know, there's like 30 or 40% of the Xers don't have $10,000 saved for retirement. There is a portion of the Xers that literally have nothing saved for retirement. Now, there are some Xers who have all the money in the world saved for retirement because they're coming out of legal practices, investment banking, things like that, CEOs and whatnot. But the vast majority of the Xers are hugely underprepared for retirement to the degree that if you buy into the quote 4% rule, which is you take 4% of your nest egg every year and you live on that and let the rest continue to grow. If you apply that to what the Xers have, I mean, you're talking about a sum of monthly income from your nest egg that wouldn't even cover 2 weeks worth of groceries in a given month. So we have a huge problem that the Gen Xers are going to be running into. Boomers are largely retired at this point. We're next up as the Xers, and those we're going to start retiring in the next 9 or 10 years, and that is going to be a very challenging period for the American economy and for obviously for the families involved.
We talk a lot about Gen Xers, and our late starters are predominantly Gen Xers in their 40s and 50s. Why do you think this happened, and why do we keep talking about Gen Xers? I like to think that potentially we're the lost generation or the silent majority because there was the defined benefit plans that went away towards a defined contribution plan, and nobody told me growing up about a 401k. Yes, I did invest in one, but I didn't know about the power of it, and I didn't know that I had to max it out and have a savings rate of 20% over a course of a career to be financially free, even in my 50s, like a lot of my friends in the FIRE movement are. It's hard to be a late starter that is watching all of your people that are your friends that got it right retire, and you're still in the mucky middle getting to the end. Do you think that this defined contribution to defined benefit transition was a big player in this?
Well, it was a huge player in that because you went from not having to do anything and your retirement was on autopilot to to retirement going off of autopilot, but nobody telling you how to fly the plane or that you even needed to fly the plane. So you end up 20, 30 years into a career and you realize, well, wait a minute, I should be saving all along. I didn't really save because America is a consumer culture, obviously. I mean, it's what drives the economy. And if I'm in my 20s, back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was getting into the workforce, I'm not really thinking about, oh, I need to save 10 or 20% of my money when I'm living in Southern California at the time, working for a newspaper out there, and my rent is X and my car insurance is Y, and I've got health coverage I got to pay for. Trying to squeeze those extra dollars out of a paycheck is challenging. But then I'm also living in Southern California and I want to live a life. I want to go to the beach. I want to go hang out with friends at movies and go to dinners and parties and things like that and drive to Vegas and drive up to San Francisco. So as all that's happening, you're spending all these dollars and nobody's telling you, hey, wait a minute, maybe don't take that trip to Vegas this week. Take that money and devote that to an IRA or your 401k. Nobody was really telling you that back then. Yes, there were stories about IRAs and 401ks, and I wrote some of them in the 90s when I was at the Wall Street Journal. But it wasn't like there was this mad rush to invest that way because A, you're 20 and 30 years old, you're an Xer, you're feral, you're invincible. We're going to survive this, it doesn't matter. Well, now we're not 20 and 30 and invincible. Now we're in our 50s, we're still feral, but we're not invincible, we're definitely vincible. So people that just they didn't have that mindset in their 20s and 30s. Defined contributions weren't there to be their lifeline later in life, and nobody told them about defined benefit for the most part.
Well, it reminds me of that documentary. This was over a decade ago from Frontline called The Retirement Gamble. And it was pretty fascinating where they were talking a lot about the shift from pensions to 401ks. And they talked to a bunch of different people that were really struggling and had no money saved for retirement, didn't understand it or anything. But it was a fascinating documentary. I just rewatched it again a few weeks ago, but I feel like it's almost like history repeating itself hearing you talk about it.
Well, how do we break this generational gap? Does formal education help? Do we have to completely overhaul the parenting in order to get this fixed? How do we fix this problem that Gen Xers really are the emblematic population of?
I mean, it's a challenge for America as an overall. It's not just an Xer situation because millennials are struggling financially, and millennials have the they lived through the dot-com crash with their parents. They lived through the housing crisis with their parents. They saw some pretty nasty economic events, and that has affected them. And they're not financially savvy either because Xers weren't financially savvy and they didn't do a very good job of teaching their kids. So it's not just an Xer situation. So what the answer to your question is, this is a situation for the American education system to step in and say, you know what, we have to do a much better job of teaching people about economics, about money. I mean, back even when I was in school, in high school in the early 80s, they had home economics. I mean, I don't think that exists anywhere these days, but you had home economics. There needs to be some sort of curriculum built into the educational system, starting, I would argue, in fourth or fifth grade, when kids start wanting allowances and things like that, and where parents start wanting to pay allowances, there needs to be some kind of structure within the educational system where schools are required to have some kind of classes that begin to teach young kids about money. What is money? How does money work? why do we have money? Why do you want money? Why do you want an allowance? What does it mean to spend your allowance all in one place on lollipops and Snickers bars as opposed to saving some of that for next week or next month or whatever? That kind of educational system, that kind of educational program at a grassroots level needs to happen in America. Otherwise, you're just going to continue to have generation after generation after generation that is financially illiterate. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, not calling somebody stupid, but I mean, it's just they weren't given the opportunities to learn this stuff. And, it's just like spousal abuse kind of stuff. If kids see that, then they're more likely to carry that trait into their own relationships. So if you have boomers that weren't financially savvy teaching Xers, and Xers weren't financially savvy teaching the millennials, and millennials not financially savvy teaching the Zs, and they're not financially savvy teaching the alphas, I mean, it's just a progression of financially illiterate people leading more financially illiterate people to the financial cliff. So you have to have some sort of system in place somewhere to teach these people what they need to know.
I couldn't agree with you more, Jeff, because yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm a big financial literacy advocate. And I know you're halfway around the world, but here in the US, not all 50 states require it in high school. Right now, there are 20, we're in 2023. There's 23 states that require personal finance as a standalone course in order to graduate from high school. So I'm glad to see that progress because it was, I think, maybe 5 or 6 back in 2009 after the financial crisis. So that to me absolutely would start to make the difference. I mean, basic stuff where they can understand it, but you were mentioning even as early as fifth and sixth grade, there's certain concepts about money they can grasp. So I think the financial literacy piece is a huge piece, and I just don't understand why there's only 23 states at this point, but hopefully there will be more and more.
I will add that obviously I don't think it's just a school system issue. It is a family issue. It's a parental issue, and it takes parents working together to make this work. And I'll use an example from my own life when my son, he's going to be 27 this week, he was probably 7 years old. We were living in New Jersey at the time, and we opened him a savings account, our little bank account, because he had started getting his allowance. And he got some Christmas money or birthday money, whatever it was, and it was probably like $25 in total. And he had it in the bank, and he went to a store, and he was into collecting certain kind of Yu-Gi-Oh cards, Pokemon cards when he was a kid, and he wanted to spend all $25 on Pokemon cards or whatever it was. And my wife put her foot down. Absolutely not. You're not going to waste your money like that. And I said, absolutely. Give him all $25. Let him spend it, every last cent of it right now. And she goes, that's stupid. We get in this big fight about whether or not a kid should have $25 to spend when he's 7 years old. And my point was, let him use it. Let him spend it all in one place on one single purchase so that when tomorrow he wants a candy bar or whatever he wants and he has no money, he has learned a valuable lesson at an age where it doesn't matter. He spent all his money, he lost all his money, he wasted it on one thing, and he doesn't have any money left for tomorrow or next week or next month. That is a lesson you need to learn at 7 and 8 and 9 years old when it doesn't affect your life. Because when you learn it at 27, 28, 29, 40, 42, it affects your life greatly. So learning to screw up when you're a kid is the best thing you can do. But that's going to take parents working together to let their kids screw up. And don't fight and try and protect your kid from not screwing up because you want them to make all the mistakes they can right now when they're young so that when they're older, they're wise enough not to make those same mistakes.
Yeah, that's incredibly hard to not act, to not intervene. For example, we see a lot of young adults get into credit card debt. And what do? Do you pay it off for them to restart the clock? No, you got to let them struggle and realize that they have to pay it off. And then they realize that, wow, there's this interest rate and I'm paying twice as much for this simple thing that I don't need, don't like anymore. It's really hard to hold back. And actually, just like that podcast you're on, it's really hard to bite your tongue.
I mean, but you're right. It is hard when particularly when your kid is in their 20s and 30s and this is happening to them. which is why I'm telling parents now who are younger, who have kids who are younger, are still making mistakes at 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, 15 years old. Let them make those mistakes, encourage those mistakes, and use those as learning moments for them, teachable moments. Look, you spent all your money on one Pokemon card, and now you can't go do anything else. And mom is not going to give you the money. I gave you the money for your allowance. We agreed on your allowance, and now you've spent it all. And I hope you're happy with your purchase, but that doesn't mean you can go off and continue to spend more money. Once they learn that at 15 or 7 or whatever the age is, they're not going to keep racking up credit on their cards when they're 25 and 30.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to grow up physically as well as financially. We see a lot of financial toddlers out there that never had the developmental financial mentorship or education. And if you delay that growing up period, and it feels like it is. I mean, you used to grow up in your early 20s, and now it seems like it's delayed to the late 20s or early 30s that you really achieve financial acumen.
And I know a lot of our audience probably feel like they may not have had a good role model at home with their parents or whatever, and they may question whether or not them themselves are a good role model. I know for me, I didn't learn anything really about money as I was growing up. And so when you're in that situation, well, it's ideal to have your parents and have them like you teach your kids smart things, or at least help them just be okay with them failing, and you know that it's a good lesson. But for those that don't, having it somewhere, where else are they getting it if they're not getting it at home? I think that's one of the big concerns too.
In that regard, Jeff, too, I think your story of growing up and your money story, because you admitted to us before the show that you're a late starter. What messages did you get as a young kid? And what was the development there for you so that our audience can understand where you're coming from? That in the end, you became a late starter just like us.
Yeah, I guess I should be clear about that. I was an early starter, but because of divorce, I became the late starter. I grew up with grandparents. I was raised by my maternal grandparents for most of my childhood, and they were on a fixed income. My grandmother was a purchasing agent for a chemical company making not much money. My grandfather sold tires at a department store, and he retired without a pension. So he retired 6 months before he was eligible for his pension, simply because he wanted to spend the rest of his life fishing. So they didn't really have a whole lot of money. So I grew up seeing money from the perspective of retirees on a fixed income who didn't have the capacity to do everything they wanted to do. Luckily, that was the late 70s and 80s when America had not jumped the shark financially. So they were able to live a respectable life on a modest income. I learned from that and I saw that, but I also at the same time had a dad who was a grand poobah at one of the America's largest Fortune 500 consumer product companies, and he was a multimillionaire, and I didn't really benefit from that in any way other than the fact that he helped me pay for college. So I saw, you talk about dichotomies. I mean, I was living poverty basically, not poverty, but I was living lower middle class while my dad was in the 1% range, and I was sort of stuck in this weird middle. Um, so I took away from that I am responsible for myself because clearly my dad's not responsible for me, and I can't rely on my grandparents who really don't have the finances to shower me with anything. They gave me a great life, and I love my grandparents for what they did for me. But I learned from that I have to be responsible for myself. And when I got my first job at the Monroe News Star World newspaper in North Louisiana, my very first paycheck, I still remember, it was like $371. And I went to a credit union up there and I put $15 in a savings account. And every time I got paid, I put $15 in a savings account. And I continued to do that. Now, the problem becomes I went through a divorce, as I mentioned, several years ago, and I lost my job at the same time at 51 years old. And so I used that opportunity. I mean, I spent 3 months feeling sorry for myself and mopey, and I'm a 51-year-old white guy and I'm going to be nothing for the rest of my life. And I sort of kicked that phase away. And I said, to hell with it. I'm going to go live the life I want to live, and I'm going to do what I want to do. And I went back to UCLA to be a screenwriter, which, as you mentioned, I've sold a couple of screenplays. And that's an expensive move to go from South Louisiana to Southern California. is not the cheapest trade down in life. I mean, it's a very expensive trade up in life, even if you're living as shabbily as I did in a 400 square foot rat trap to go back to school. But I also lost a bunch of money in the divorce proceedings, spent a lot of money living in California. And for me, moving to Europe when I did at 50, whatever I was, 52 years old or whatever, when international living called, part of that move was to jumpstart my life financially. Because as expensive as London and Paris and Zurich are, most of Europe is radically less expensive than America. And I mean radically less expensive. I moved from Los Angeles to Prague, and my cost of living went down by probably 45 or 50%. I moved, like I said, I'm now in Cascais, Portugal, a little beach city on the west coast of Lisbon, and which is probably one of the most expensive communities in all of Portugal. And my cost of living here is probably 60% less than what it was in Los Angeles. So for me, moving to Europe was a way to jumpstart my finances again late in life and begin to rebuild my retirement plans that have been taken apart, and to get out of debt because my paychecks went so much farther. When you're earning a Western income living in Europe, your paychecks go a whole lot farther. So for me, that's where the opportunity came. But I realized I had to start over. I did not want to reach retirement at 67, my full retirement age, and have to worry that am I going to be able to survive on Social Security alone?
So you succumbed to financial devastation late in life. Were you frugal and good enough saver that you were still coast-fi or weren't completely devastated by it?
Because I had been saving all along, like I said, since that first $15 deposit in 19, January of 1989 when I got my first job. I've been saving all along. And you're talking about the defined benefit plans earlier. When I was working with the Wall Street Journal for 17 years, most of those years, the company had a stock purchase plan for employees. So I was buying Dow Jones stock before it became part of Rupert Murdoch's empire. And so that helped sort of cushion my life because I had put all that stuff into an IRA, I think it was, or wherever it ended up. I'd been saving in the 401k plan pretty nicely, like I don't know, 7, 8, 9%, whatever the number was, and I was increasing it every year when I got raises and whatnot. So I had a cushion that I could fall back on. Obviously, a good part of that cushion, half of it went away, and a lot of it I wasn't able to touch because it is in IRAs and 401ks and things like that where I don't have access to it without penalties. So, and I absolutely refuse to tap into an IRA or a 401k and pay the penalty. I'm just not that stupid because the amount of penalties that is involved is usurious. I mean, it's a crime that they take that much money from you for tapping into your 401k and your IRA early. So I really only had liquid savings to fall back on. And I didn't have a ton of liquid savings. I had enough to kind of see me through California and the cost of living out there and the cost of going back to UCLA. But still, as that was dwindling down, I was getting increasingly nervous like, what do I do? And that's when International Living called and said, hey, do you want to come work for us and live in Europe? And it's like, A, yes, and B, that's a great opportunity for me to rebuild my financial life.
It seems too that you're a big proponent of folks in their 50s starting small businesses. It sounds you're a freelancer, you're not just a W-2 employee, I imagine, or you're an independent contractor. But tell us a little bit about the advantages that late starters have in life transitions, Geoarbitrage to Europe, and or starting a small business.
So I'm not W-2. I'm purely contract work only, and I've been like that since 2018, so for the last 5 years, more than 5 years now. I am a huge proponent of taking the skill set you have and turning it into income opportunities online. And yes, there is the geo arbitrage, I call it, the idea that you can trade a life in America for a life in Europe. And an example I use, and I've used a lot of times, is the cost of living in Biloxi, Mississippi, or Gulfport, Mississippi, is actually more expensive than in Malaga, Spain. And no offense to people in Mississippi, I love Gulfport. My grandparents are from Mississippi. But if somebody gave me the opportunity to live in Gulfport or Biloxi, Mississippi, or Malaga, Spain, I would take Malaga, Spain any day of the week, twice on Sundays, and it's less expensive. And it's old world historic charm. And the point being that if I can take a skill set and turn it into an income stream, and I can live someplace really cool that I love, that I feel excited by. I wake up every morning and it's a new culture, a new world, new things for me to do, and it's less expensive for me, and I can get my financial life back in order, and I can sort of deal with whatever debt problems I have. To me, that's a hell of a trade. It's a fantastic trade to make because you are taking this skill and you're becoming a consultant, you're becoming a writer, a designer, whatever it is that your skill set is. There is an opportunity for you online to make money at it. And if you can do that while living overseas, you get a tax benefit. And I don't want to get into all kind of tax issues with people, but as an American living abroad, you're eligible for something called the Foreign Earned Income Exclusion. And it basically says that for 2023, I got to write off $120,000 in personal income. I owed Uncle Sam $0 on the first $120,000 that I made. All right. That is a huge tax savings. The only thing I owe as a freelance writer is that I have to pay self-employment tax. Well, that's at 15.3%, I think the number is. But I get to deduct all my expenses for my travel, for my home office, all the things that go into expenses. So my 15.3% is now it's going to fall down to probably 10 or 11% as a net tax for me living overseas. So that is just a huge opportunity to move overseas, benefit from a ginormous tax break, and have a lower cost of living, a greater standard of living, and you're able to rebuild your life financially. To me, that's a win-win-win-win-win.
So, does it help to be an empty nester? Did this start as an empty nester, or did you start with kids doing this?
Well, I have kids. I mean, my kids were older, and I was obviously divorced at that point. So I would assume, I'm not going to assume. I don't think you have to be an empty nester because I know that there are parents, and I've met some of them, who have moved overseas in their 40s and 50s with kids who are younger. I see these people all the time. I speak at international living conferences. The most recent one was in Denver in September, and I had people there come up to me who still have kids. I mean, there was one family that was from Kansas City, maybe I can't remember where they were, who have kids that are 11 and 13, I think there was. And they're moving to Spain because they want the opportunity to teach their kids about cultures elsewhere, which I think every American needs to learn, but that's a separate topic. But they want to move because it gives their kids a greater view of the world. It gives them greater experiences, but it also allows them, the parents, to radically reduce their cost of living and to increase their savings for retirement. That was their big issue, is that we want to be able to save more for retirement, and we also want to ultimately qualify for a European Union passport so that we can retire to Europe, where we know it's going to be a lot cheaper for us to live. Because if you have an EU passport, it's just like having a driver's license from Florida and deciding you want to live in Montana. You just jump across the state borders, it's fine. It's the same with an EU passport, and they want to be able to retire to someplace cheaper in Europe than they know it's going to cost them to retire in America.
I think I'm loving that plan, Jeff. That's great. Well,
I
I think I'm loving that plan. I mean,
it,
I
it's a really good plan. I mean, I know for a lot of people, it's kind of scary to think about. Well, wait, I'm going to be 50 or 60 years old, and I'm going to leave everything I know and everybody I know in America, and I'm going to leave a healthcare system I know, and I'm going to leave the Whole Foods that I know, whatever, and I'm going to move to this foreign place where I don't even speak the language. I have no clue what to do, how to find a doctor. I understand all that. I went through that. And trust me, moving from Los Angeles to Prague and moving from the English language to the Czech language is like moving from the Earth to the moon. I mean, it's just so different. But A, it's exciting, and B, you get used to it, and C, everywhere you go in the world, people speak English except one class of people. The only people around Europe that wherever I've gone in Europe that don't speak English are the ladies at the checkout counter in the supermarkets who get really mad at you when you don't weigh the fruit properly, and they pretend they don't speak English and they yell at you in their local language. So other than that, it's really quite easy to get around anywhere I've been in Europe in English. So, but the idea is this plan is that it really is a great opportunity to consider relocating your life, even if only for several years, just so that you can begin to rebuild or build a, a nest egg, because you can save so much more money. When like I said, I was living in a 400 square foot rat's nest in Los Angeles, and it was costing me about $1,400 a month. I moved to an 1,100 square foot 2 floor apartment with 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, brand new kitchen in the nicest area of Prague, a beautiful tree lined street with 17th and 18th century buildings, the lining the entire street, looked like old world Europe. My ceiling was one of those slanted European ceilings. It was nothing but a glass wall, basically. It was 80% glass looking out over the sky in the city. And it cost me $1,300 a month. So I upgraded my lifestyle and downgraded my cost. And that was just for the apartment. I had no need for a car, no need for gasoline, no need for car maintenance. Food is radically cheaper. Healthcare was like, for me, it was $129 a month versus $550 a month living in Los Angeles. So, like I said, the cost structure goes down really dramatically. The quality of life goes up really dramatically. And the money you save, it becomes just like a spigot of cash flowing into your savings account.
Well, that sounds ideal. What are the
Wow.
downsides?
The downside, well, you are, I mean, I'm just going to assume you're talking about Europe. I mean, the downside is you are 5, 6, 8 hours away from America if you want to fly home. Of course, if you move to Mexico where it's even cheaper, you're an hour flight from home. If you move to Costa Rica or Panama, you're a couple hours from Miami. Downside would be, again, trying to deal with people who don't speak English in certain situations, like the supermarket checkout ladies, which isn't, it's not like it changed my lifestyle in a way. It was kind of annoying, early on, because you kind of felt like a moron when she was pointing at, you weighed the bananas wrong and you have no clue what she's trying to tell you. So you feel like an idiot for a couple of weeks, but then you get used to it and you just disregard it and you learn the system. One of the other downsides was dealing with the healthcare system to a small degree. And again, this was only at the checkout lady level or the check-in lady level. You go to check in and they don't always speak English, so you struggle explaining which doctor you're there to see. That all the doctors and dentists and nurses, every single one of them speaks English absolutely perfectly. You go into a dental office, and it was like going into a dental office in Los Angeles. It was absolutely the same 2019, 2020 quality. It's the same thing here. I had to go to a hospital here because I hurt my shoulder, and the hospital is much smaller. It's probably a tenth the size of a US hospital, but it is super modern, ultra modern. They had to give me a CT scan. It was something that came out of some Mayo Clinic kind of thing. I mean, it was absolutely first world healthcare. So, and it was much cheaper. My CT scan cost $119. And that was out of pocket. That was me paying out of pocket for that kind of stuff. So
No insurance.
yeah, I didn't. I mean, I had insurance, but in this particular case, I have to pay out of pocket
You
to
didn't.
refile for the insurance. So it's $119 out of pocket, and then I file insurance after that. So I mean, I can't tell you that there are other downsides, because it's exciting living in someplace new, particularly someplace like when I was in Prague, because it's Central Europe. It's part of the old Soviet bloc, and it still has that kind of feel to it. But it's a super modern city. It's just a super modern city wrapped up in old world Europe packaging. So it's really beautiful. I'm in Portugal. It's an incredibly beautiful place. It's like somebody took parts of Southern California circa 1950s, parts of Napa Valley, parts of Sonoma, and they jammed it all together into Portugal. I was in northern Portugal this past weekend, and it literally is. I mean, I'm driving around, and it's on the border between Portugal and Spain, and there's a river that runs through it right along the ocean, and you feel like somebody has taken the best parts of the Smoky Mountains and the best parts of Puget Sound and jammed it together into northern Portugal. So I honestly I don't find a lot of downsides. There are things that will be annoying to you, but there are things in America that annoy the hell out of me all the time as an American. So I don't really find those trade-offs to be any different. So I don't see a downside other than the fact that you might struggle a little bit with English early on, and you might miss your family and your friends. But other than that, they're going to want to come see you anyway because you're living in a cool place.
So, do you think you'll ever return to the US, or is this a permanent decision?
That's a good question. I mean, my immediate answer is I'm going to stay. I mean, I want to buy, like I said, in northern Portugal. I actually want to buy a house up there because I love the atmosphere up there, and it's an hour from Porto, which is a beautiful old world European city, so I can get to the airport really quickly and be anywhere I want to be. I don't know that I would come back to America. I've been back to America several times in the last 5 years for conferences and to go see my kids. And every time I'm back in America, I got remarried, and my wife here will say, "Do you miss it?" And it's like, I miss hanging out with my son and seeing my kids. I don't miss America. I don't miss what America has become. There's so much animosity in America these days. There's so much hatred. There's so much red blue divide. The America I know, the America I love, is the 1970s America I grew up in as a kid. The story I tell is back then I was like 1977, 78, let's call it that. Me and my friends, four group of kids, were walking down a major street in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where I grew up, and we each had shotguns on our shoulders. I had a 410, and my friends had 20 gauge and 10 gauge, 12 gauge shotguns, and walking down just a normal street in America, and the cop stopped us, and the cop got out, smile on his face, didn't have his hand on his pistol. He just, "Hey, where you kids going?" It's like, "Oh, we're going over to the Witters property to go shoot some squirrels." And he goes, "Okay, be safe," and he drove off. If that happened today, you would have SWAT teams converging on this. You would have national media talking about how parents are raising their children wrong. The America of today is not the America I grew up in, and I don't like the America of today, and I don't mean to offend any Americans. I just don't like where America has gone. It jumped the shark somewhere along the line. Maybe it was after the 2001 attacks. I don't know. We just jumped the shark and we're not the country we used to be. So because of that, I don't necessarily feel at home in America anymore. I miss my kids, but other than that, and I miss Raisin Canes and I miss Pop Tarts. But other than that, I mean, I really don't miss a lot of what America is today.
Well, I can resonate a little bit with that. I lived in Europe myself for a couple of years. I lived in the Eastern Bloc as well, and it felt very different. Being an expat was very different. I wanted to go to med school there, but then all of a sudden, somehow I felt like I couldn't do it. I had a bit of imposter syndrome, and I returned to the US where I am today. And I want to go back and retire in Europe too. I think my wife would be on board with it. And where you are in Portugal seems very appealing. And it seems like it's all a trade up, and the only trade down is your kids in the end of the day.
It really is. I mean, like I don't necessarily tell anybody they should go to northern Portugal where I want to go because it's probably an acquired taste because it very much is similar to Puget Sound kind of weather and things like that, which I know not everybody wants. But if you go to southern Portugal down in the Algarve, that place is literally Southern California 1958 to 1964. I don't mean that in a backwards way. I just mean that it is not overgrown, it is not overblown, it is not overpopulated, it is not just jam packed with traffic. It's just a beautiful stretch of Southern California style beach and lifestyle on the Atlantic Ocean, and it's just a fantastically wonderful place to be. I mean, there are parts where I turn the corner and it's like, I have seen this exact same view in San Juan Capistrano, California, or in San Clemente, California, or somewhere along the coast in Huntington Beach. That's what it feels like. The housing doesn't look the same. The housing looks very different. but the atmosphere, the ambiance feels like Southern California, which is why the Algarve has basically become Southern California in Europe, because there's so many Californians who are moving there because they can sell a house in Southern California for $1 million, and they can buy $1 million house in the Algarve for about $350,000. And so they've made a massive lifestyle improvement with exactly the same kind of atmosphere and ambiance around them, but at a substantially reduced cost.
So what happens, say the day comes where you have grandkids? What happens then?
I am a selfish person when it comes to that, because I get to ride this merry-go-round one time. Everybody gets to ride this merry-go-round one time, and I want my retirement years to be happy. I can go and I can see my grandkids. I don't I don't have to have them around me 24/7. They're not going to want to be around me 24/7. My kids, whenever they have their kids of their own, they've got a life they're going to want to deal with. They don't want to deal with me always being there. That's probably opposite of what about a lot of people think. That's fine. It's just I don't want to downscale my life to go live in America just so I can see grandkids. And I know that sounds selfish, and I recognize that. I would much rather be a happy person living the 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 happier life in Europe, knowing that my grandkids and my kids are probably going to fly to see me because they want to go hang out at the beaches in Portugal, or they want to go meet me in Italy, or they want to go meet me in Greece or wherever. To me, I think that brings a, a different skill set to the retirement game, to the grandparent game. If I can afford to fly them to Europe, that makes a whole lot more sense than me living in the US and not being able to afford the kind of lifestyle I want. If I can save money living here and say, hey guys, I can fly you to Europe, come on over, spend the summer here with us, that to me is a far better way of being a grandparent than living in the US and being unhappy with the lifestyle I would be able to afford.
So where do people find out about this lifestyle you've adopted? How do they research this? Is it international living, or what resources would you give them to investigate this?
I mean, it's sort of self-serving, but yes, it is international living. I mean, we've been writing about this since like 1979, I think it is. We have a history of this. We have correspondents who live this life, and we write about it. We have conferences every year where we tell people, here's how you move to Europe. Here's how you move to Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia. Here's how you move to Uruguay, which, by the way, is a fantastic country most people don't pay attention to. So we have that's our expertise. That's where we really thrive and as a publication. Beyond that, I mean, there's a lot of resources online. I mean, there's all kind of influencers these days who are writing about this on blogs and in Instagram posts and YouTube videos and things like that. I can't really point you to any of them because I don't pay attention to what they write. I mean, I'm so busy with my own writing in my own life, I don't really have time to worry about what others are saying about Portugal. I'd much rather be living it and writing about it myself. But yeah, I mean, I would tell you the best resource without being self-serving is clearly international living, because this is their world.
So Jackie, you're going to Thailand soon. Are you going to come back?
I don't know, after Jeff has is everything he's saying about overseas, I don't know if I will come back, or I might extend my trip just a little bit. But now I'm even more excited, Jeff. I'm sitting here with like bated breath, and I definitely want to do more overseas travel. And perhaps a lot of our community have been thinking about wanting to do that. Maybe they do have kids that are now adults and they're feeling like they can go away, or they're close to five, where that's one of the things they want to do more of. So
Where are you in Thailand?
Bangkok, and probably my best friend, she is Thai and Lao. So she speaks the language, and we've been wanting to do this trip for a very long time. So we'll go to Lao, and after that, it's all up to her.
Yeah, I actually wrote about Thailand. I think it was last year for International Living. I spent I don't know how long I was there. I was in Bangkok, Chiang Mai, and Koh Samui, the island of Koh Samui. And I was doing some research. I went to see a house in Koh Samui just for like rental properties for people who want to live in Thailand long term, retirees or whatever. I went to a house, and it is a 3-bedroom bungalow that is sort of in a U shape. So you have this courtyard in the middle with a pool, and it looks like Balinese style architecture. So it's all open air, really beautifully maintained inside, beautiful appliances, everything. It's really, really high end property. It's got a nice little courtyard, the pool, the little plunge pool kind of thing, a small little yard, and at the back of the yard, there's like banana palms and everything, and there's a little gate, and you open the gate, and you were literally on the sand on the beach is your backyard, and it was $995 a month.
Well,
That's
it's
what I'm talking
Oh
about.
my gosh.
That's what I talk about when I say you can upgrade your lifestyle and downscale your costs so dramatically when you think about these opportunities to live overseas, work overseas, whatever. And Koh Samui is such an international destination. Every single place I went, there was English speaking going on. There's a giant Aussie hamburger bar with all kind of sports kind of stuff going on every day of the week, and it's always jam packed with expats in there. So you don't, when you're living overseas, you don't miss being in America because there's just so much opportunity to speak English and talk to English people or Aussies or New Zealanders or Brits or whoever it is, Canadians. They're everywhere. So to me, there just really is no downside other than if you really want to be home, you got a long flight.
So today we've talked about trying to re-educate our kids on financial life. We've talked about the retirement crisis, and we've talked about your solution for the retirement crisis, international living. These things seem to string together, and we'll have in the show notes a lot of the links we've talked about today in order for people to investigate this. Now, let's remember, however, that we're talking to a late starter community. And Jeff, you said you were a redo late starter. Do you have any specific tips based on your financial journey, research, education as a financial journalist that your top three that you would say to give them hope and to give them actionable things that they can do to pursue your lifestyle or their best life?
It takes a bit of a mental reset to acknowledge that I don't have the resources I want to have for retirement, and to actually do something about that. You can't just look at it, realize there's a problem, and then just hope it goes away. It's not going to go away. You can't just look at it and say, it's too much for me to handle. I'll come back to it next week or next month or whatever. It'll be my New Year's resolution. You can't do that. I mean, you really have to say, I have to fix this problem, and I have to fix this problem now. There's that famous saying, when's the best time to plant a tree? It was 20 years ago. When's the second best time to plant a tree? Well, it's today. Today is the day you have to start. I mean, you don't put this off for another day. You don't put it off for another week. You begin thinking about, if you are in a financial situation where you realize that your nest egg is not big enough, you have to look at your life and decide, what can I cut out? Are there things that I'm willing to part with so that I can build a safer, more secure retirement for myself? Am I willing to consider something like moving overseas and the benefits that accrue in terms of taxes and whatnot? Does that make sense for me? Can I retire overseas? Because there are a lot of places. The average Social Security check is about $1,800 a month or something like that. But that's based on everybody. People who even retired back in the 90s and before. If you were to take the people who are retiring just today at full retirement age at 67 or whatever their age is, you're closer to about $2,000 a month. And if you look at a couple, the average is about $2,500 a month or slightly more in retirement in Social Security checks. There are places in the world where $2,500 a month will cover your entire nut for the month. And these are not like living in some squalid shanty town in the middle of some godforsaken country that nobody's ever heard of. I mean, there are places in Ecuador, and Ecuador is a beautiful country, and it is highly rated among retirees who absolutely love living in Ecuador. In Ecuador, a $2,000 retirement every month is you're living well there on $2,000 a month. So there are places in the world that if you truly are approaching retirement and you don't have the nest egg and you don't have the time to build a nest egg and you have no way to sell off a bunch of assets to create a nest egg, all you're going to have is Social Security for the most part. There are places in the world where you can live a really nice retirement on Social Security alone.
Well, we live in a world economy. I invest in the Total World Stock Index Fund. Maybe we need to broaden our imaginations as Americans that there is a robust life for us outside of America. In spite of all the opportunities we have here, there are significant opportunities elsewhere, and you won't be alone. There's a lot of people that are doing the same thing, much like yourself.
What you're talking about, it is actually increasingly popular. And I mentioned I speak at these international living conferences. International Living for the first time is holding a conference in April in Europe. They're holding it in Portugal. And when they announced it, it had room for 200 people. The 200 people sold out in 2 days, and they had to go back to the hotel and ask them to increase it to 300 people. And the hotel found a way to increase the space in the ballroom to fit at least 300, or to fit at most 300 people. And they posted it. We have another 100 slots available. It sold out instantly. So there clearly is a growing demand among Americans to find better opportunities, better lifestyles at a cheaper cost overseas. And you're beginning to see that in places like Portugal.
That is definitely a conference I want to go to. How about you, Jackie?
And it's in the Algarve. It's right on the beach.
And I think the next Catching Up to Fi meetup needs to be in Portugal. What do you think?
That sounds like maybe our first conference should be there. Well, they just had a conference in Bali, of all places. And like I said before, my
Oh, yeah.
co-host is still coming back from Bali, and she'll be back with us soon. But Jackie, I want to thank you for co-hosting again today. Jeff, I want to thank you for taking the time to educate us on several aspects of international living and its advantages. We look forward to talking to you again soon about other aspects of your financial knowledge. Thanks again for joining us.
Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate being here.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Hi, Bill and Becky. My name is Paul Mollenkoff. I just wanted to let you know how much I enjoy your work and thank you. I've been involved in the FI community for a number of years now, and Catching Up to Fi is something that I've really been drawn to. I was a late starter also. At this point, I've pulled myself up to what I would call comfortably coast Fi. Your recent episode with Cameron Huddleston really resonated with me, as my mother is 83 with dementia and memory issues. Some years ago, my sisters and I believe we've taken most of the steps illustrated in this episode, but we're going to get Cameron's book, Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk, just to make sure we've left no boxes unchecked. Once again, this was just valuable, life-aiding information from Catching Up to Fi. Thank you so much.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Catching Up to Fi. We would appreciate it if you could leave a 5-star review so that our message can reach others.
We are not lawyers, financial advisors, accountants, or tax experts. Please consult your own professional advisors before making any important decisions. Our content is for entertainment and education purposes only.
We'll see you next time on Catching Up to Fi.